Let me welcome you from Paris, from UNESCO's headquarters, for the third session of the series of Futures Masterclasses, which UNESCO is running as a coordinator of the HLCP Foresight network in partnership with sister entities. As you know, this pilot initiative has been designed with the aim of fostering peer learning and knowledge transfers on futures and foresight for our UN colleagues. The masterclass series will introduce participants to key methods and tools in futures and foresight for policymaking in 6 standalone sessions. Some of you might have followed already the first 2 ones. We organized 2 masterclasses in 2022 covering horizon scanning and scenarios. And it is with pleasure that we can acknowledge the growing number of participants, registrations, and follow-up activities, this one being the biggest for now. I spoke about 6 masterclasses, so that means we have additional ones in our pipeline. One is on foresight for systems change, another one on participatory futures and futures literacy, the third one to follow over the next weeks. But today we have a fascinating topic, I would say. Our third masterclass is on applying science fiction and speculative design to real-world problems, led by UNDPPA, with the support of UNESCO, but also invited experts from Arizona State University, UNDP, and UNGP. And to ground a little bit the topic, let me just add a few words by saying, in the face of an omnipresent uncertainty that I guess we all feel, and unknown unknowns, speculative futures and science fiction can enable out-of-the-box futures thinking that goes beyond mere extrapolation of past and present trends. As we always say at UNESCO, the future cannot be predicted. And I guess we all think here that it is inevitable that discontinuities, surprises, and black swan events that we cannot know in advance will certainly emerge. Therefore, speculative futures beyond rising awareness and sensitizing over the potential sudden unexpected change can allow us to reframe, expand our perception, and draw inspiration to innovate the present. And this masterclass, as you have seen, has a very important thematic focus on peace and security. And in the context of our commitment to promote peace and prevent conflict, there is certainly a call to strengthen international foresight. And this is why we believe, together with our colleagues from UNDPPA, that speculative futures is a valuable approach for organizational innovation, which is foreseen in our common agenda for the upgrade of the UN, especially also against the backdrop of our quintet of change. And without further ado, let me thank you, especially UNDPPA, our colleagues Martin, Minji, and our invited experts today for your availability. And to all the others, I would like to open the session and wish you a very nice experience in our masterclasses. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Krishnan. It's great to be part of this series, and a big hello from New York City to colleagues out there that are joining us from various places in the world. My name is Martin Waehlisch. I lead the Innovation Cell in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. As Krishnan mentioned, joined by my colleague Minji Song. The 2 of us are going to facilitate the session today. This session is going to have 2 components. We're going to start with an expert panel. We're going to introduce quickly our speaker in a bit, and then we have an interactive exercise where you that are virtually joining us today have a chance to try out speculative design and science fiction hands-on through an exercise. The panel will take around 45 minutes. We record the panel. The exercise will not be recorded, so it provides a safe space to try out new things. So join us for that second part. And the whole session today will be around 90 minutes long. Now, let me start with a few words about science fiction and speculative design from the perspective of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. We turned to speculative design and science fiction at the anniversary of the United Nations a few years ago when we celebrated 75 years of the UN. And for us, this was an opportunity to basically create new imaginatives. As Krishnan said, we can't really predict the future, but we can certainly shape the future. And it is very hard to come up with new ideas. So science fiction is really a way to spark a thought, to try out unusual issues and explore imaginatives that we can use to come up with new devices, new technologies, new approaches to do better in delivering on peace. This is certainly a part of the quintet of change, Foresight, and Speculative design is one methodology of strategic foresight. And we see this pretty much in combination with other foresight methods. So we're not here to say this is the non plus ultra, this is the only foresight method we use in DPPA. We draw from a range of methods, but we thought we have an eye on an unusual method that is increasingly used in the public sector. If you think about the military, we have seen a range of initiatives. I'm just going to point out the Mad Scientist initiatives. They just hosted a conference where they brought together science fiction authors to define the future of warfare. And in that very context, we think it's even more important to think about the future of diplomacy likewise. Now, a few words about our three distinguished speakers. We are joined by Aarathi Krishnan, who is the strategic foresight advisor for UNDP, and she previously worked for the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies. Then we have our colleague from Global Pulse with us, Lauren Parater. She is the creative strategy lead at UN Global Pulse, and she previously worked on a project of UNHCR, which is called Ansang. I hope we hear a bit more about that as well, which is very exciting, thinking about speculative design in the context of refugees. And then we're also very honored to have Ed Finn with us. He is the founding director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University, where he has been an associate professor in the School for the Futures of Innovation in Society at the School of Arts, Media, and Engineering. And he has covered a range of issues, including imagination, digital cultures, creative collaboration, and so forth. So this is a very exciting panel where we have practitioners and academics, like a mixture. Aarathi was also a researcher for quite recently. So that there's a mix of practical issues and theoretical elements. And we thought we'd keep this interactive. So Minji and I are going to turn to our panelists with three questions, and then we kind of see how this conversation goes. We won't have a chance, unfortunately, because of the limited time, for a Q&A session. So if you have thoughts and questions, you can use the chat function, or you can use the survey that we're going to send out at the end of the session, and certainly stay in touch with us. We're going to post the email address to the innovation cell later here in the chat. So we just see this as the beginning of a conversation. With that said, I turn to Minji to kick us off with the panel, and excited to see how that goes. Over to Minji.
Thanks, Martin. So lovely to see everyone here. And I will kick off with the first question. So the first question is, we're talking about speculative futures, science fiction, as well as speculative design. I would like to ask the panelists, and let me start with Ed, what does that actually mean for you? And can you give us examples of real world examples? Ed, please.
Thank you, Minji, Martin, everybody, for including me. What a great conversation to be having with you all. So we started the Center for Science and the Imagination 10 years ago to address a problem that I think all of you must be thinking about because you're here today, which is how do we improve our collective relationship with the future? For most of us, that relationship is really dysfunctional. People either don't think about the future at all, or they think that it's hopeless, or they think that they have no power to change that future. Maybe they think someone else is going to take care of it for them. And those are not very productive relationships. And especially when we're talking about the serious issues of peace and global security, it becomes really important for people to feel empowered to imagine their own futures. And the mission of our center is to inspire a collective imagination for better futures. And so I see our work, broadly speaking, as building imaginative capacity. And I think that one of the biggest fundamental challenges we face as a species is that we need many more people to feel empowered and invited to imagine their own futures. So what does this mean in practice? For us, we really center our work around storytelling, because if you want to change the future, you need to start by changing the story that you tell about the future. And the best stories are the ones that are inclusive and many people can believe in. And those are the stories that motivate change. So as a couple of examples, one thing I'll talk about is we've done a lot of work around climate futures. This is an area in particular where many people, especially young people, feel anxiety, maybe even despair. Everybody at this point, I think, recognizes broadly what the challenges are, but it's very difficult even for people who are working in the trenches to imagine positive futures. This project is supported by Climate Works, which is a major international NGO doing climate projects. And we've commissioned 4 fellows from around the world to write technically grounded, positive futures about climate. Not where everything is going to be great and it's all rainbows and unicorns, but where communities and individuals find ways to adapt, to demonstrate resilience, to contend with climate, but still have a hopeful vision of the world that we want to work towards, instead of just worrying about the worlds that we want to avoid. So we've done events in and around the COP process, Congress of Parties, partnered with various other groups like the British Library, TED, and the goal of this project, which is ongoing, is really to invite communities and people around the world to imagine their own positive climate futures, because we need many different communities to start to do this work. It can't just be a top-down effort. Another thing I'll briefly mention is a project we did around AI policy futures, and asking, how can we start to tell better and more helpful stories about the near future of AI, instead of spending all of our time worrying about, God machines, super intelligence, or killer robots, all of the ways in which AI is really impacting our world in the present. Through initiatives like this, we bring storytelling together with different kinds of policy expertise, technical expertise, and we invite not just the people who participate in those processes, but much broader publics to start imagining different futures and to hopefully start to think about the futures that they want. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Lauren, do you agree with Ed's description of speculative futures? And also, how have you applied it to solve real-world problems?
Yeah, I think Ed had a lot of great points that I feel like I align with. I'm going to speak a bit more to this project, but this idea of storytelling is so important in terms of imagining futures and thinking about the narratives and worldviews that we're trying to shift when we're speculating. And in terms of my sort of background and experience in speculative design, this really began exactly through a creative project that I led at the UN Refugee Agency's Innovation Service. And Project Unsung was a speculative storytelling project. We launched it in about 2020, and that brought together sort of creative collaborators from around the world to help reimagine the humanitarian sector and promote imagination and foresight in our work. It was organized loosely around these 3 core themes, one which was nature, the other was power and identity. And these were really identified alongside our colleagues that we were working closely with. And the project really offered these new visions, these new narratives, these new stories and perspective on humanitarian work through mediums such as essays, science fiction as well, design fictions, poetry and artwork. And I think, sort of due to the nature of humanitarian response being quite reactive, we wanted to experiment with speculative design and ask colleagues to really slow down and give attention to the future of our work and also the future of displacement. And I'll be sure to drop somebody dropped a link already in there. But yeah, people talk about this idea of using speculative design to solve real world problems. And I would actually say that its value is really locating itself in opening up these possibilities rather than maybe problem solving. And I can speak again to the relationship that I have with Project Unsung, but these are really methods that can create spaces for others to imagine and see these alternative possibilities through provocation and also speculation. And through that practice, you can follow through with actions and to test and really prefigure these different futures through behaviors and culture change. And I'm sure most people in this room would agree that we need those alternatives to our current system. And yes, speculative design is one of those tools. I'm also not married to speculative design, but it should be also used together with different participatory approaches.
Thank you, Lauren. So Aarathi, from your point of view, what is speculative futures and how has it been used to solve real world problems?
Hi, thanks, Minji. I hope everybody can hear me. Nice to be here. Also just really thrilled to be speaking alongside Ed. I love his work, and of course, love the work of Laurel doing that work with Project Unsung at UNHCR. So I'm actually going to speak with a different hat on, not my UNDP hat, although I might refer to some of the work at UNDP. So I'm going to speak about the work we did when I was the global lead for strategic foresight for IFRC. So this is going back quite a few years now, so I'm probably giving away my age, but I think, so this is going back to 2016 was when we started on this process. And I love speculative design. I think when we use it, and I love both Lawrence and Ed's points, and when we use it to open up our minds to the evidence and rigor of the insights we want to push forward, it can really help push forward different, to push different decision making in a way that just producing reports can't. And that's where I find in my experience, it's really worked incredibly well. So when I was working with IFRC, we were looking at the futures of humanitarianism, the humanitarian sector, and what we could look at. We had embarked on a year-long process where we worked with I think it was over 140 countries where we had a Red Cross office to understand how they utilize, a horizon scanning process essentially. And it was a very, very rigorous process. We then, from that, we generated up a report around the futures of humanitarian action that we were then taking to the Red Cross Red Crescent General Assembly. There was a specific ask that we wanted because we wanted our stakeholders to approve that we utilize a foresight method because the emerging risks that we were seeing on the landscape, we didn't want to repeat of the same strategic design process as previous years, but we needed every member of the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, 194 countries, to approve it. So rather than just providing this big in-depth report, and as much as I was wedded to it and wedded to every word written in it, it was a reflection of the changes as seen through both technical experts, academic experts, thought leaders, civil society, etc. Instead of just presenting the report, we decided to run the first humanitarian experiential exhibit. So if you can imagine, we were in the big UN building in Geneva, and we worked with 4 different speculative designers. What we did was we took this massive report, we then aggregated up to different provocations and scenarios using what Lawrence insights on the provocations as well. And rather than just talking about these various themes or categories, we turned it into an artifact or a story. And then the designers all worked on creating that artifact and that experience. And then the exhibit by itself was a whole storytelling mechanism. So the moment you walked into the exhibit, it started to say, this was 2016 and we were saying you're in 2030. And so and we learned from how museums curate their exhibitions, the story and the experience you want told as you go through it. Each designer came up with their version of that particular scenario or provocation. It blended AI, it blended physical artifacts, it blended art. We had an artist that converted upside down what the bed of the sea looked like to actually turn it into space. So it really just took insights that were very grounded in evidence and rigor, but pushed it to a speculative future, to a speculative provocation. And we asked lots of what if questions, and we used poetry, we used nursery rhymes. It was a wonderful thing, and it was such a hit that it then went on a bit of a multi-country tour. What we found really helpful with it was people could read the report if they wanted, and we had a lot of senior decision makers going, well, yeah, but isn't this a bit too far out? Like, what's the evidence here? How do you know this is going to happen? And we could say, well, these are the ideas that it's based on. And whether you used a mix of art, and we also had augmented reality we were using and virtual reality, you could see our senior decision makers suddenly having a very visceral experience of what the report was trying to say. So rather than saying, you know what, heat is going to be a major issue, or air pollution is going to be a major issue in X amount of years, they could smell it, they could experience it, they could see it, they could put, and it changed the whole thing completely. Needless to say, we got approved to use it, and I would say it was the mix of using speculative design plus the rigorous work that really helped it. And just to close the loop, then 2 years later, when we finished the strategy, and again, it went back to the General Assembly for final approval, we again engaged with designers to, rather than just saying, hey, this is what the strategy says, we turned it into a gaming room. So you walked into this gaming room and everything, and it was like a choose your own adventure. And you could start to see the different elements of the strategy, but in real life, and you had to make choices about which one you would choose. So again, in order to have a more visceral, real appreciation of the types of issues we wanted our senior decision makers and stakeholders to consider, the speculative design, the art, the poetry, the storytelling, the gaming all help bring that bring that to fold. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aarathi. So I'm getting the sense that this is the opportunity for experiential processes, both in that collective imaginaries or different imaginaries or different futures, but also, as you say, Aarathi, for the visceral kind of experience of decision makers and the opportunities that it provides. I'm also getting the sense that this is a complementarity. It's not just one tool that is going to be applied to all contexts, but I'll ask Martin for the next question. Thank you so much for this.
I just want to stay with Aarathi for 1 second, if you don't mind, and we'll drill down a bit further. I'm just wondering how you dealt with critique that this could become a circus, or this is just performative and this is art, but shouldn't have a place in an eminent organization like the Red Cross Federation. So if you can elaborate a bit on the process, that would be great. And that's the second part of the conversation we wanted to have with all three experts. Like, how did you actually structure that? I already understood that the organization went through a thorough foresight exercise. You had this report which was signed off. So that sounded like a communication exercise, right, to explain what was in the report. And if you can run us through it, also, how did you address bureaucratic hurdles? Because it must have been an uphill battle. If you do this in a museum, it makes sense because it's a museum. But if you do this like in an eminent federation, like the Red Cross Federation, just tell us more. How did that go, and how did you make it actually happen?
So first of all, we had a year of research that went behind it, right? So there was already that process behind it, and we were already introducing foresight methods. But yeah, because the fact that we were able to say, no, we didn't just come up with this provocation of, while I was sat there having a coffee, it's actually based on evidence and rigor, and you could show the substantiation from the research that was done. So that absolutely helped. The second thing is we involved all our, and we were really lucky. Dr. Jamila Mahmood was my boss at the time, who was a big supporter of foresight. So she was very supportive and also provided protection but also provided the parameters and ensured that we were involving our senior secgens and all of that from the very start. So there was no surprise. And they approved every single artifact. In fact, of all the artifacts that came through, some of them we couldn't put up because we didn't see a political red flag on something, or we didn't consider, how would we know? We had no idea that this would set off that particular country. So having that approval process and that buy-in from the start was really important. But it was the fact that we had, this wasn't, it didn't come off from 2 months work. It came from a year of research and a very participatory process. It was evidence-based. The report was sent out well in advance, and that got approved, and that was, people really, really liked the report. So it was almost like taking things in stages and pushing people out of their comfort zone in phases. We weren't chucking people right into the speculative end from the start. And I think that's the trick. Martin, I remember us having this conversation about the bridge building, and the trick is pushing our constituents enough so that they're uncomfortable, but not pushing it too much that they think it's ridiculous. So doing it in phases really, really helped.
And then out of the artifacts and objects, you know, and for some colleagues here, even the term artifact sounds so foreign, you know, like from space, you know, an artifact in the Red Cross, you know, halls. What was your favorite one? And which one did you think, you know, was not too far off, like too much Mickey Mouse, you know, but also not too simple, so that, you know, like we're like, oh, okay, I knew that, you know, so like something that still provoked them. Which one do you think really did the trick?
There were three actually. So one was an AI model of what a country of what a fully virtual country office would look like, and how they would make decisions entirely based on AI about which, you know, this again going back to 2016, so it is a few years ago, but you know how much resources we would send for what kind of crisis, and it would calculate it straight away. So it was just like you could put, it was like a computer screen and everything that, but it was provoking the idea that more and more jobs were being automated, and you know we were looking potentially at a future where country offices and might be making decisions entirely on AI. So I thought that was a lot of shock in people's faces when they saw that, oh, this wasn't just something that tech futurists were throwing out, this could actually happen. The second was a much more simpler thing. One of our designers had a beaker with a calculation of what the air would smell like in Mumbai by 2030. And this was really cool. So honestly, the water was just like really bad smelling water that we chucked a whole bunch of stuff in. But when you press, but it was based on a calculation of the types of mixtures of waste that would be in it. And so the beaker, you press a little thing and then the air would come out, and then you suddenly smelt what the air would smell like. And we explained what the calculation was. We explained exactly what the different types of waste categories went in there. The last one was actually about, you know, you put your little finger into like one of those assessments, those things, and it would tell you immediately what your health assessment was. So it would tell you whether you were, you know, like, were you infected with malaria? Were you infected? This was again, you know, just a couple of years after Ebola. So this was fresh in a lot of people's minds. So the reason I liked them was you could see the visceral shock, or the visceral like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that this is going from something crazy I read or a podcast I heard or anything else, and actually turned it into, well, this is what it actually might smell like and feel like and be. And I know I don't want somebody to know immediately that whether I've got malaria or if I've got this disease, and I want to speak to a doctor. I don't want a robot to tell me. So yeah, those were some of our favorites.
That's great. And there's a question whether you can share a link. You know, Minji already shared a few details. I want to turn to the UNHCR example, and that's a question basically for Lauren, you know, on Project Unsung. And I think it goes for all speculative approaches. It's easy to criticize the artifact, the object, you know, the exhibition. Oh yeah, this is too childish or not, but it's actually hard work to come up with, you know, those references that can be used then to engage in a conversation, right? And I wonder, Lauren, whether you can run us through Project Unsung a bit more. How did the request come about it for it? You know, was this just a cool idea from UNHCR Innovation Services where you wanted to try out new things, or was there somebody, you know, higher up who asked for it? Like, how did the request come about? How did you bring the people on board that build those different, you know, artifacts as well? So if you run us through the process, that would be, I think, helpful to win over some more like-minded allies here in that conversation. Over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Martin. So this project was done on a much smaller scale than the project that was just mentioned. And it really came out of the innovation service wanting to test different ways of working. There really was no sort of engagement with foresight or futures within the institution. And this felt like a really nice place to start. Although we did not have the buy-in, and that's a lesson learned, I would say, next time around that I do a project like this, is that, yeah, from the beginning, I think that there was a lot of criticism on the project itself, because when you are speculating and you are, you know, having these provocations, you are questioning the status quo. And a lot of people didn't like that. So that was a really big lesson learned, is how do you meet in the middle? But in terms of the process, it was really a small experiment. I think our total budget was less than 15 grand, which was all spent on paying the people who contributed pieces to it. And we did initially a call for practitioners, creative collaborators, I think was the language we used, who were interested in exploring narrative foresight with us. We sort of just threw out this call for applications, thinking maybe we'd get 1 or 2 people we could explore this with. And we ended up getting a huge amount of applications of people that were interested. We had, poets, we had academics, we had colleagues from Parsons School of Design, we had foresight practitioners from Brazil. Like, I don't know how they found us, to be honest, but it really started with this call for applications. And then with them, working very closely with colleagues within UNHCR and some of the refugee communities that they were working with, to start identifying these different narratives and worldviews that we wanted to look at. For example, in one of the speculative fiction pieces, it's called There is Life After Extinction, The Journey of Dunya Island. And the author imagines UNHCR in the year 2047. And the fictional piece is about a new unit that UNHCR has created called the Intergenerational Responsibility Unit. And the unit is dedicated to working with communities that sort of face the loss of their environment due to ecological collapse, changing climate. And the piece very clearly opens up possibilities of UNHCR's work that are intergenerational, that imagines an organization that isn't running on a 12-month program cycle, for those of you familiar with program cycles in the UN, that imagines a new governance structure of our institution, a new relationship with place as a UN agency. And so these types of articles and stories were created alongside colleagues. So it wasn't just, what was in Lauren's head or what was in sort of the head of the innovation services head. It was really done in a collaborative way. And to be honest, we do have this output of stories and artifacts and insights. But in a strange way, actually, that process of designing and learning from everyone was almost more valuable for me, that act of experimentation and what I learned from really this community of people that we had for 18 months trying to think about this together. And yeah, we had workshops. We ended up actually launching the project at an art gallery in Oslo with one of our creative collaborators and inviting everyone there to hold the publication. And it was a really wild whirlwind experience. But to go back to some of the beginning points, in terms of challenges, I think that critique is a big one, and having the buy-in is a really important aspect of doing projects like this.
Oh, thanks for pointing out that the process is often, more valuable than the output of the process, or the journey itself is available. I want to turn to Ed and just hear from you a bit more about also the climate change and other speculative projects. And there is a question here from one of the participants here about the pie in the sky. Like we do this exercise, we end up with the exhibition and the report, but how do we really translate this into action? And if you can think about like a good example where, and we have talked about this actually in our first conversation, how do you translate this really into change? Not just in the experience itself, but an actual change. Like, would be great if you can speak about this a bit. Over to you.
Yeah, well, let me first say, offer kind of 4 arguments for people looking to make the case for doing this kind of work with their own professional communities or getting buy-in from other partners. So the first one is values. If you look at the values and the mission of the organization you're working with, futures thinking is probably going to be really important, and the status quo, almost by definition, is not actually getting us to where we're trying to go. It's not leading to transformational change, it's reproducing the status quo. The second argument that you can make is urgency. The status quo, again, is not solving these challenges. The challenges are too important to just keep doing the same things over and over again when we have this evidence that they're not working. So futures thinking and bringing more creativity to the table is an urgent need. It's not nice to have. It's not a luxury good. Imagination is not a luxury dalliance. It's actually essential to resolving some of these great challenges. The third one is resilience and anticipation. Going to the sort of the title of this masterclass, the practice of imagining different futures and exploring the possibility space builds resilience, and it helps organizations and groups prepare for possibilities. It's not that these activities are crystal ball exercises. You're not predicting the future. You're practicing thinking about different possible futures. And the fourth one, which you can't always say out loud, is that it's fun. And sometimes people just need an excuse to do something, to do this. And if you can frame the excuse in a way that is professionally acceptable, you can really get a lot of buy-in that way. And you can't force people to do this. So you have to work with the coalition of the willing, the people who are going to participate and collaborate. And when you try to force people to imagine the future, they're not going to do it. To elaborate on this a little bit more, we've built up a set of methods for how we approach this work. And this is a paper that we published open access a couple of years ago around our sort of version of this process, which we call collaborative imagination. So if anyone wants to look at that, they can. But basically, the invitations that you make are really important. We think about all of our work as an invitation. It's an invitation to the participants and to what you were saying, Martin and Lauren, the people involved in our process are the most important output for us. It's not the artifacts or the stories that we produce. That means that the work itself is also an invitation to broader audiences to then step into these futures. And visceral work, like Aarathi was talking about before, is so powerful, right? It's being able to touch the future, smell the future, see the future visually represented can be really effective. And again, it's a really inclusive way to bring broader audiences in who might not find a white paper or a technical report accessible at all. It's very common to encounter these kinds of institutional barriers, and you have to find ways to frame the work that meet the needs of organizations that you're working with. So one interesting example of this for us was a project on space futures that we did with NASA. NASA has I would say, a love-fear relationship with science fiction. So there were some anxieties about doing this project with us, but they were very supportive and enthusiastic. And we reframed these as I think we called them narrative-based scenarios about the near future of space exploration and commercialization. And the method is very important. And the outputs of this project, this book that I shared a link to, is one of the audiences is technical engineers and policy people in the NASA community, but it's also accessible to a broader public. And it grounds these questions of space exploration in economics and history and psychology, as well as technical challenges. It combines fiction and nonfiction, and it includes some really beautiful artwork. And I think all of those things together allow you to open a kind of side door to the future. Because when you think about the status quo and the sort of normal modes of doing things, there's a lot of gridlock. There's a lot of, zero-sum game argument about what's going to work or not work. And if you can open that side door and say, this is just a completely different way of thinking about things, one of the impacts I look for in all of our projects is when somebody comes out of this saying, I'm really thinking about my work in a different way. I'm changing the trajectory of how my sort of overall framework. And those impacts, I think, are really powerful. But sometimes it takes a long time for those to pay off. And that's okay too. We still are harvesting things from seeds we planted 10 years ago. And I think that's a sign that the work can continue to, it's not a short-term effort, it's a long-term effort. And it's really about a broader cultural shift to changing our relationship with the future.
I couldn't agree more on the last part. We're in the innovation community, we're often pushed to show revenue, right? Where's the impact of your work? Where's the concrete product? And then we love to point to the report. We love to point to the workshop. But like the transformational perspective that you just pointed out, with an individual that maybe carries that knowledge, that capacity further and does great things, it's hard to measure. Like swear an oath. Yes, I did it because I was in this session on the 19th of January 2023, and I listened to those 3 great experts. that inspired me to do X, Y, Z. So I think we need to be honest and fair about it. And I think all three of you have pointed out maybe a few issues when it comes to process. I'll hand over to Minji in a second. One is, I think you need to have some kind of institutional mandate or buy-in. Some opening. I mean, Laura mentioned that with the unit or the thematic focus that create a little bit of an opening. Aarathi had a kind of a report at hand. So I think that's one process element, some kind of change moment. The second thing that you all pointed out is in terms of process, that it needs to be collaborative. It's not just something given, you commission, you receive, but you develop it together. And through that, you learn. And then the third part that you all pointed out, and we can probably discuss it further, that all of you have thought about how do we put this into action. You might not have directly kind of the answer for that. You might not necessarily kind of show the evidence of the doing, but all of you thought about that. And that's tailored into the process. It's tailored into the process. I hand over to Minji for the last part of the panel. Very exciting.
Thanks, Martin. So I'll lead from that last question in terms of how, and we have so many colleagues from the UN who work on peace and security issues on this call, and I would like to ask the panelists to be kind of provocative. What is it? How should we be using speculative futures in addressing peace and security issues? And let me start with Ed as a non-UN person. How should the UN in addressing peace and security issues use speculative futures?
It's a great question and one of the fundamental challenges of our time. But I go back to stories. I think humans are storytelling animals, and a good story can contain the complexity of a complex geopolitical dynamic in a way that is legible to most people. We're bad at risk assessments, we're bad at math, we're bad at probability, but we're all pretty good at stories. And a well-crafted story can contain ambiguity and possibility, foreground and background, different tensions and points of view, conflict. It can have all of that in one character in a story, right? And so stories can be really effective microcosms or sort of compressed formats for offering visions of possible worlds. And if there's one thing that we need in the context of global conflict, it's visions of positive futures. And the reason we have conflict is we're fighting against things. And when we identify things that we want to work towards, when we identify narratives and visions of unity and narratives and visions of peace that we can all buy into, that's how you start to pave the way forward, right? When the most powerful stories are the ones based on fear and anger and despair, then we're not working towards the better angels, right? We're not working towards that more positive future. And the last point about stories is that they are inclusive inherently. Well-crafted stories are not only for technical experts. They're not only for politicians or legislators. They can invite everybody in to have the same conversation. And actually, when we're talking about this kind of broad level system, complex system change, you need to have a narrative that works on all of those different levels, right? The level of security, the level of politics, the level of culture, and when you see the most effective stories, that's how they work, right? They invite dialogue between all of those different sectors, because all of a sudden everybody has some shared vocabulary, some shared ideas to debate and discuss. The story doesn't necessarily have to begin by being the one solution that's going to take care of everything. All it has to do is start that dialogue and build consensus, build momentum, and finally. These narratives can invite us to imagine futures that are more inclusive. And stories can remind, one of the reasons that we have conflict is people dehumanize and exclude other humans from their thinking. And a good narrative can remind us of our shared humanity and the things we have in common. And I know this might sound sort of hand-wavy and easy to say from the armchair, but this is how it works. This is how politics works. This is how propaganda works. It's storytelling that has been crafted to achieve particular, near or long-term ends. And so you have to, in my opinion, you really have to take storytelling very seriously as part of the toolkit for achieving any kind of, global conflict resolution.
Thank you, Ed. Storytelling. new visions, new narratives, or aligned narratives. I wonder, Aarathi, do you have anything to add to that, or even more provocation from the point of view from UNDP? You've been in this process for such a long time. You're leading this process. What kind of inspiring last comments can you make for our colleagues working with the security issue?
I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned through this, and something that we put in place for UNDP Asia Pacific, was a process called inclusive imaginaries, because the provocation is, whose stories are we telling? And whose visions are we prioritizing or putting forward as the only idea of that one future? I mean, Ed's heard me talk about this before, but we need to be careful in this space. And this is the case with all elements of foresight, right? Like, whose visions are we privileging? Whose stories that are we telling? And one of the things that I loved about Project Unsung was it really took a very diverse range of storytellers that came in to provide that. When it comes to issues of peace and security, you know, how we understand peace differs a lot from context to space. How we feel safety, how we feel belonging, how we feel conflict plays out looks very different. And I think one of the challenges that I have had with science fiction in particular, which then, you know, was the basis of us doing a different process here at UNDP Asia Pacific, was that science fiction is a Western construct. And in a lot of the spaces in communities I come from and the spaces we work in, you know, when we're growing up, I grew up in Malaysia. I didn't know what science fiction was. I wasn't exposed to it until you know, a little bit later in my life. So if we understand that science fiction is a construct of one type of perspective, then what are the other constructs? Is it lore? Is it mythology? Is it the ancestral stories we tell? So how do we weave those into the ways we decide, you know, the visions and stories and imaginations we unfold? And the last part that comes out from this is also the ability to imagine is a luxury. And that's one thing that I would say very, very strongly. And we saw that come out with a recent project around inclusive imagination that we ran with our country offices in Asia Pacific, where we worked with a designer from India to design a very different type of toolkit around imagination based on local indigenous knowledge, etc. And what I have learned through my years is that when you come from a space of fragility, of fear, of vulnerability, of all of this, the ability to imagine becomes a luxury, because what you're looking to do is be safe, provide food on the table. If you also come from countries where your education system was rote learning, you know, that was what it was like when I was growing up. You had to memorize what was in the blackboard and then you spit it out for your exams to pass the exams. You weren't taught critical thinking. You weren't taught the ability to, you know, think broader than what was in your textbook. Then again, the idea of imagination or the ability to imagine becomes a lot more constrained. So as we're developing ideas about and processes and approaches, particularly working in very, very fragile environments, insecure environments, underserved environments, recognizing that people's ability to tell their own stories exist in different ways. And one of the provocations I would put forward, particularly through, for all our work and particularly through a peace and security lens, is be careful who we get to help facilitate those storytelling and imagination processes for us. Because if we're only putting forward a Silicon Valley or a very privileged idea of what harm can look like or what fear can look like, then we're really not being inclusive. And this takes a very, very intentional approach and understanding the ethical roles we play when we facilitate imagination.
That's beautiful. That's food for thought for, and I'm sorry, Lauren, to give you the final word after these great interventions. So right now with Global Pulse, what are your thoughts in terms of, for the UN system, dealing with issues such as fragility, dealing with peace and security issues? What are your provocations in using science fiction, speculative design, and speculative futures, experiential futures, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the most simple terms, like this is an opportunity to have us think differently, a tool to imagine different ways of doing our work at the UN, and that includes peacekeeping, that includes thinking about these types of contexts. But we also don't have to have such a large process. It doesn't have to be so complicated for colleagues who do want to start. If you want to start asking questions that allow you to speculate, such as what is the current worldview that you're designing your work from, or what is a radically different purpose or philosophy for that system you're working in. What can you do that really embodies this and allows others to experience this as a possibility? And I don't think that this is limited to just, people working in headquarters. This is something that people can do in operations all around the world. And I would say also this idea of sandboxing within the context of stories is another way that speculative design could be used in this case. For example, working with the system as if it was a closed system and then taking out elements or adding an element. Does the system collapse? The big what if function used by Ursula K. Le Guin. What if colonialism never happened? What if there was no men? What happens to the system? And speculative work allows us to conduct experiments in a way that I think otherwise we wouldn't be able to do in real time, especially when you're working with people in very complex environments, or when you're working with specific communities. And that element of safe space for experimentation is important. And I think speaking to what the other panelists have said about, inclusion and thinking about who's in the room and who is facilitating this is really critical to all of this work.
Thank you so much, all masters. I think you are now referred to as masters of speculative futures. So in terms of the takeaway, and before closing to the breakout rooms, the playfulness of speculative futures is something that I'm taking away. The fact that it needs to be with great intention. So considering who is facilitating that conversation, who is included in that conversation, but also that we're constantly doing this anyway. Storytelling is something that we're constantly doing. It's all around us. So if we are doing this with intention, this is something that could lead to more meaningful outcomes in terms of peace and security work. I'll pass back on to Martin. I think we're severely over time. So thank you everyone for still staying with us. Martin.
Thanks, Minji.
But thank you, masters.
Big thanks to our experts. This concludes the first part of the master's class. Some of the experts might stay on, but if you have any questions, colleagues out there, reach out to us. We're happy to connect you with them. Now it's time to get our hands dirty, and we thought we'd give you a chance to experience speculative design in action. This is basically based on the work that we have been doing in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs around science fiction. I mentioned that we dipped our toes into this method in the context of UN75, where we looked at, how will peace negotiations look like? Will there be still a handshake? And this was, at a time where, we couldn't really yet imagine the fallout of COVID. How will the Security Council feel? What's the smell? What's the color in the room? And that's not to define a future, but to provoke you thinking about how that future could look like. Because if I just say, tell me a story about diplomacy in 2050, it's pretty hard to start. So a visual prompt might help, because just showing you that image, I could imagine that you have already your movie in your head going on. And likewise with regard to mediation settings, how inclusive will they be? What kind of challenges will new technologies pose? And how will the field work of the United Nations, of our different field operations that we have, look like? Will we still have the term special political missions or peacekeeping operations? Will we just give it different terminology? One thing is clear, that the future is mundane. So it takes a lifetime to change procurement in the UN. So those plastic chairs will probably remain. The coffee cup will remain. We carry the past pretty much into our future. I can't tell you how much stuff my kids collect at home, and I have to admit I did the same. So we just rediscovered things that I collected. I will not tell you how old I am. Some years ago, let's put it that way. So the future is pretty much shaped by the past because we find comfort in the past. It's so much more known, and the uncertainty creates some anxiety. Now, the exercise that you will have in front of you, and we will put you into different breakout rooms with colleagues, and that's going to be a little bit of a moment of luck as well, is to imagine the following. We're going to parachute you right into this situation here in a hangar, which you know, the location is undisclosed. So imagine it is a crisp winter day in an undisclosed location, 40 years in the future, 40 years, so not so distant. And the United Nations have gathered representatives from 2 conflicting parties in an unusual conference room. So it's not like, you know, conference number 4 or 8 that you see in the Secretariat, with the goal of facilitating peace negotiations. And as a member of a team of designers, so you're not necessarily a political advisor, you're now a designer. You are, and whatever that means, by the way, you know, show me your passport that you're a designer, whatever that means to be a designer. You are there to unveil the latest creation, a device, and here it is, that is believed to assist negotiation parties in reaching agreements, this device. And the facilitators in the breakout rooms will zoom in on that in a second. And your job is to explain how this device works. So we're not going to give you kind of, you know, the moment where you have to actually draw it, so we give you already a device. But you have to think about what function does this device have? What's the name of the object? What materials are used? What's the cost, the branding? You will have some time to basically take a few minutes to think about this alone, because the future is often a lonely exercise. Yeah? So the facilitators will give you a few minutes just to decompress and think about those factors. And then this is going to be a group exercise. You're going to brainstorm together about aspects related to that device. And then we come back here to the plenary to hear from the facilitators how that conversation went. And in around half an hour, that master's class will liberate you to jump right into another Zoom call of the day. Again, big thanks to the experts. And I hope our UNESCO colleagues can do the technological magic now to place us into the right rooms. Wonderful. So let me turn to Danish, Annie, Minji, Nick, and Ariana to hear how it went in their groups. Let me start with Annie. Annie, how did it go in your group? Some lessons learned, anything you'd like to share? Over to Annie for a second on this.
I think we had a wonderful discussion, very interesting, and very different ideas on what this device is doing, which is great, because obviously that is also a showcase on the different needs we have. And I think we all always reflect our own kind of field of expertise into it, which is great. It's good to understand that people might see different things as the main needs. So we had different kinds of functions for monitoring, for collecting different voices, for collecting and using data, even detecting lies in the situation. And I think what was really interesting, we had a good discussion on the data it uses and the biases. And I wish we would have had more time to discuss whether using data in the future is actually making the situation more neutral, or is it actually risking that the data itself is biased and is bringing some biased data into the discussion. So definitely wonderful ideas. And I think we discuss also a lot of the risks, and it's great to kind of identify that all these things are opportunities, but also risks.
Thanks so much, Annie. Nick, how did it go in your group?
We had a really good conversation in our group, and we made an object that can do quite a lot of things. For example, it's lightweight and can be carried to remote areas to like include and involve marginalized groups in these conflict negotiation discussions. Also, it's able to make sure people get equal opportunities to speak, and it's kind of like helping the assisting with the moderation in that way. But also is able to notice when the what would you say, the emotions and sentiments in the groups are changing, and like alert the in-person moderator that there's a sentiment change happening, and then maybe even have a safety feature where if the emotions are changing too dramatically, it automatically calls a timeout and like makes everybody like take a break and a breather and come back. So that was a part of it. And then finally, it's able to take in different positions and spit out what they have in common. We got a little bit into like technical features such as materials, like it would have to be lightweight and a lightweight material. It would have to have AI functions. It would have to have instantaneous translation functions and components. And meanwhile, I think my own observation about how the whole discussion went is that it's really interesting to spark a conversation about the future, kind of from this like this object that you can look at and detail. And like some of our participants were really able to like hone in on different aspects of the picture and say, well, it clearly has this kind of component on it in the picture. So what is that doing? So it's really interesting scaffolding for imagination. So that's our report.
Thanks so much, Nick. Ariana, how did it go in your group?
It went really well. We had very interesting ideas, quite similar to the other two groups that just presented, and we had also some fun. So we had the mutual arbitrator, which is a peer deal accelerator, and it has several functions, such as to tracking body language and be a truth detector, tracking sentiments, but also visualizing potential scenarios and making visible their potential impact. We discussed that it should be accessible to all, and actually that all the citizens will feed data and information. So our mutual arbitrator will be facilitating mediation processes, taking into account the values and the preferences of all citizens.
Thank you. Danish, how did it go on your end? What did you learn from this experience?
Great. Well, first of all, we came up with an amazing name for it. And of course, it's an acronym. And so we went with Ubuntu, which could be Ubiquitous Background United Nations Telemediation Unit. I just made that up on the fly, by the way. But yeah, we had some of the same ideas. For example, it could even connect to AI, assisted dialogues that the public was having, that it then informs the people in the room where the public stands on a particular issue, just so that they're representing the views of their various constituencies in a way that's honorable. It could include within it, these kind of AI agents that are constantly negotiating with each other, so that it informs the humans what maximizes or increases chances of agreement. For example, it might say things like, if you guys can figure out how to share water, it'll increase your chances of agreement by 50%. The whole biometric and psychometric aspect of it, where that someone else was saying earlier as well, where it's engaging with measuring people's stress level, their heart rates, and forcing a pause when needed, or it has a light that goes off. It can also engage with wearable devices that others are wearing in order to make them more calm, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that we thought about. We also thought about how is it powered, what kinds of materials is it made with, can we use it? Can we use this as an opportunity to communicate, some points of the UN or the UN stance on sustainability, recycled carbon, recycled chips, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks so much, Danish. Minji, how did it go on your side?
I think many of our participants were saying very similar things in terms of what it actually does. But for us, I think it was really interesting, the conversation in terms of what value add does it provide to this scenario. So it was very much looking at the environment. Many said that it actually is not a very inviting environment. Is it a level playing ground? Why is the actual object, preventing like eye contact between the mediators? Is it something that actually enhances trust, or is it indeed actually used by the negotiators as credible analysis or evidence to kind of help the negotiation? So really interesting exercises, kind of like a metaphor of the ideal negotiation space and the negotiation scenarios and all of the kind of the functionalities that are needed. Over.
Thanks so much. Our group looked a lot at aesthetics, saying, maybe not something you would necessarily put into your house, but it works in a negotiation hanger, right? So how do we deal with aesthetics? So form and function go together. We hope that you got a taste for speculative design and thinking as a designer in the UN context. That was the purpose of today's session. Big thanks to all of you for staying on. Big thanks to UNESCO for making this series possible. There's going to be a survey being sent out. I think they might also post a link right here. There you go. So if you have a second, please take that survey, and we see you all soon again. Have a great day.